A famous quote once said, craziness is when you keep doing the same action but expect a different result. And this is basically a key ingredient when we're talking behavioral economics in connection with negotiation. If we continue getting into a negotiation the same way we've always done, if we have the same behavior and think we should do the same or reach the same conclusion as we've always done, well, we are not going to get a different result. So really, remember this, success is what happens after you survived all your mistakes. And I can personally say I have possibly done all the mistakes you can talking about negotiation. But what is really educational is every time that you messed up in a negotiation, take a minute or 10 minutes or half an hour after each negotiation you've been involved in and sit down and go through what did I do really well? How could I actually improve? And what was the missing link in this negotiation? Behavioral economics is also about the game theory. And if you guys have ever gone to Vegas, you might have been visiting a casino and you might have been sitting at the roulette. And you are probably suffering from the same thing as I am and everybody else is. When you're looking at the different colors coming up. What is truly interesting is, and a lot of study has been doing on this, has been done in this fashion, that we're looking at if red have been coming out 6 times, there's a tendency we believe now they have to be black. But why? There's no mathematical proof that red couldn't come out 20 times or 25 times or 38 times, but gamblers start playing on the opposite color the second we've seen that one color is coming out a certain amount of time. So we have a lot of studies proving that our mental approach into making decisions is basically just playing at the casino. We don't really know what we're doing. As you might recall, the famous Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning professor who is basically the father of modern behavioral economics, have actually concluded that we are completely irrational. That means that we make a decision based on emotions and then we act the fact that proves that our emotional decision was absolutely right. And that is basically the casino effect we're talking about here. The same goes in elections. When we have to elect a person in politics, we have a tendency to go with the one we have a feeling with, and we have a tendency to go with the one that we feel is more trustworthy rather than the one that might benefit ourselves the most from a financial or political point of view. A lot of study has been done regarding behavioral economics into the whole world of people and monkeys and animals as well. And for instance, one thing we know as well is that people who are mentally in a shaky period of their life make very different decisions, obviously, than people that are in a very stable period of their life. We also know that men in relationship with attractive women have a tendency to make different conclusions as well, and they do take more chances and take more risk the second there's an attractive woman in the room than they would otherwise. And they would never admit they're doing that, but it's just basically a deep instinct on how we interact and how we behave in order to look good or in order for others to perceive us as very successful. I'm just wrapping up by asking you a simple question, and that is if you should remember something. For instance, how many people that live in Colombia? If I was telling you, asking you this question, is there more than 40 million people living in Colombia? Would you say there is more or less than 40 million? This would be a way of trying to manipulate you as well, because the real number could be closer to 10 million, but if I'm saying do you believe it's more or less than 40 million, you will start thinking higher numbers if you have no idea how many people that are actually living in Colombia than if I just said how many people do you think will be living in Colombia. This is what we call the anchor effect, and that basically means that if I'm opening up a negotiation by saying we have to reach a level of 150 million, even though my target could really only be 30, there'll be a tendency that the whole thinking about cost and value will increase as well. So the first number that comes on the table is what we call the anchor effect. So be careful about that and think about the first number that you see in any kind of negotiation. Let's assume for a second you are my absolutely best friend and you and I are out driving in my car. And I have to admit something for you, and please don't share that with other people, but I have a tendency to speed just a tiny bit. And in this case, I'm speeding as well. And unfortunately, we hit a cyclist, a person on a bicycle. Now, the police arrive, but they are not able to measure that I was actually speeding. So they can't do anything about it, but I'm still charged, obviously, with the fact that I hit a bicycle. So we have to go to court 3 weeks from now. Now, my defense attorney is coming to you as my best friend, and you are sitting next to me in the car, and he tells you the following. He said, Your observations are really the final thing that will make your friend go to jail, pay a huge fine, and lose his license for 5 years. Because if you tell the truth that he was speeding, he will go to jail, he will get a huge fine, and he will lose his license for 5 years. But if you don't tell the truth and just say either you don't know or you're saying he didn't speed, he will just leave the court without any negative result. He will not go to jail, he will not get a penalty, and he will not lose his license. So it's all down to you. Now, what would you do if you were my best friend? Would you go to court and tell the absolute truth that you saw I was speeding because you saw that? Or would you actually be lying or bluffing and telling the judge that, no, my best friend was absolutely not speeding? What would you actually count the higher value for you? Would that be the system - the court, or would it be the relationship to me as a friend? Now, what is really interesting when we do this moral dilemma question around the world is that different people, different part of the world perceive this very differently. And what is interesting is that nobody really see that they're wrong, regardless what kind of approach they might have, but they always see that the other kind of approach is the wrong one. Some countries actually believe that you should be absolutely honest in court. And even though it is your best friend, if that would sacrifice the relationship with your friend, well, you still have to be honest and tell the truth to the judge. Other countries in the world would look at you, if that's your approach, and saying, are you absolutely insane? How can you jeopardize the relationship to your best friend in order to be honest to the court system and the judge? If we just rank some countries in the world, then we see that Canada is on top of the listing of countries that would be honest. So the majorities of Canadians would go to court, they would sacrifice their best friend, but they would have the main loyalty towards the system and the judge. And then we go down, we see Sweden is pretty high on that, we see Denmark is pretty high on that, and then it's actually dropping a lot. And if we go down and look at countries like Russia, Korea, and China, we see that the majority of people in these countries will have a tendency to go to court and lie to the judge. And what is really interesting, if you ask people in China, Russia, and Korea, they would argue that that's the right thing to do. They would not consider that a wrong approach. And on the other hand, they would actually look at people in Denmark, Sweden, and Canada and claim that they are not really human. Because they would say, how can you jeopardize your best friend in order to be honest in the court and be honest to the judge? How can you actually sacrifice the relationship with your best friend? I'm sharing this because it's really interesting to look at how differently we as human beings perceive our moral dilemma like this. And there's nothing really no right and wrong. It's basically just a question how our cultural programming are and how we see this from a behavioral economical point of view.